Hi there, welcome to Create with Copper. Today we're making this gorgeous Art Deco pendant, and if you want to see more techniques and tutorials like this one, hit that subscribe button. Now let's get weaving. To make this, you need 1mm diameter copper wire, which is 18 gauge, 0.4mm diameter copper wire, which is 26 gauge, some small beads. I've got 2 to 3mm rounds and 6 to 7mm drops, and I'm using copper, peridot and garnet. Then you also need 2 jump rings and your chain and clasp. And the tools you need are your flat nose pliers, round nose pliers, wire cutters, an awl and a hammer and block. The shape of this pendant might look quite complicated, but it's actually a matter of just following the template. And I've made this template available to download from my blog, which I'll link to in a card above and in the description below this video. We'll be weaving over pairs of wires throughout the pendant, and there are 2 sets of wires that make up the pendant. So the first follows this shape, and the second overlays that in this shape. So for the frame, I've got 2 pieces of my 1mm or 18 gauge wire that are 20 centimetres long, and 1 piece that's 40 centimetres long, which I'm going to fold in half. I only need the long piece for this section of the frame, so I'll set the other 2 aside for now. And using my flat nose pliers, I'm going to make a bend in the middle of that long wire. And once I've bent it around, I can then use my flat nose pliers again to make the bend as tight as possible and the 2 ends running parallel. And I'm starting at this point on the template. And we're ready to start the weaving, so I've got 1.5 meters, which is about 5 feet of the 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. I'm going to wrap that 7 times around one of the wires. This will eventually be right down by the bend, but you can start it a little bit further up the wire because it's easier to hold and then move it down afterwards. I'll just slide that down as far as it'll go, and then I want 2 wraps over both wires. Just take the wire right the way around both wires. Then I'm going to take that weaving wire through between the wires and wrap around one wire, the same one as I did before, 7 times. I'll then wrap 2 times around the 2 wires, and this 7-2 wrap is going to be what we weave the whole pendant in. And you might find it's useful just to clamp those wraps with your flat nose pliers. It just settles the wires and holds everything in place. And I've now woven up to the start of the first bend. So I now need to make that bend, and I'm going to use my small flat nose pliers, it's a little bit easier to get in, and take what will be the innermost wire on that bend and make a 90-degree or just over 90-degree bend in it. If you make it slightly more acute and then bend it back again, you tend to get a sharper bend. And then just a little further up, I'll make a bend in that second wire, because that one wants to sit on top of the first. And you might just need to play around with those wires to get that bend right. But just make sure you're happy that you've got a sharp 90-degree bend. And I'll continue the single wrapped wire around that inner bend, and I think I'll need about 5 wraps for this. And then I'll wrap over the 2 wires twice again and continue the weave as before. Now I've woven up to the next corner, so I just need to make the bend as before. And continue weaving and making the bends following the template. The only thing to watch out for in this section is that you haven't got much weaving space between the bends. So you just need to make sure that you're fitting the wraps over 2 wires between those bends. When you come to make the 4th bend, make sure that the wires are going to sit under the weave that you've already made. And then weave up to where the wires cross. Now's a good time to check that you're happy with the shape and that it's following the template fairly accurately. And then we're going to fix the weaving together where the wires cross. So to do that, I'm going to take the wire around the top weave, and it's worth using the awl for this just to make a space for the weaving wire. And then I'll thread it through to the back. Make sure that it's sitting nicely and is tidy on the front. And then I'll continue the weave on the back wires up to the next bend. And I'm just going to continue bending and weaving the shape as before. Check it against the template regularly to make sure you're following the shape. And where those wires cross again, I'm going to fix them together as before. And then a few more wraps after the crossover completes this section. Those two wire ends will need to be splayed out to hold the beads, but it's easier to leave those wires where they are for the next section. Now that the first section is woven, we're going to weave the second section onto that, and this uses the two wires to form this shape. But before we start weaving, I'm going to finish one of the ends of the wires. And I just want to hammer this. This will stop the weaving from slipping off the end of that wire. The hammered wire end will be the uppermost wire of those two, sitting on the right. And the second wire needs to be long enough to also include a loop on the end. So I'm going to start at that hammered wire end and wrap 3 times around the wire. I'll then add the second wire and wrap twice around both wires. And then I'm back to the weave that we've done previously, wrapping 7 times around that top wire and 2 times around both wires. And once I've got the weave started, I can push it down to the end of that wire. And continue the weave up to where it crosses that first section that we've already completed. Where the wires cross, I'll attach the 2 sections together in the same way as I did where the wires crossed previously. So I'll make a space for the weaving wire with my awl, thread it through the first section, weave it around the back, check that the wires are in the position that I want them, and then continue weaving. And I'll attach this section of weave to the previous section wherever they cross. And it's just a matter of weaving it in the same way as previously, and shaping the wires as you go. When shaping the top left corner, the thing to bear in mind is that you want to attach the chain here with a jump ring. So you need the space in that corner to accommodate the jump ring. To do this, I'm going to make a rounder bend on the inside wire. And bend the outside wire a touch further out than I've done previously. This should be just enough to get the jump ring through, and you can test it with your jump ring if you want. Once I'm happy with that corner, I'll continue weaving. And I want to do the same thing on the last corner on the right hand side. Once I've attached the 2 sections together at that last crossover, I'm ready to finish off the outermost wire. So to do this, I'm going to cut it off a few millimetres down from where it crosses over. And then carefully hammer that wire end. I want to make sure I'm not deforming any of the rest of the piece. I'll then take 2 final wraps over both wires. And then wrap the single long wire a few more times. And then I'm going to bend that hammered wire end towards the back. The weaving is now complete and we're ready to start adding the beads. Before weaving on the beads, we need to splay out those 2 wires that are still running parallel. To do that, I'm just going to take my flat nose pliers and make 2 bends next to each other. So one of those wires is heading upwards and one down. I'm going to attach the wire that's heading upwards to the frame just to give the whole piece a little bit of extra strength. So I'll cut that a few millimetres beyond where it crosses the frame. And I'll hammer the very end of that wire as before, just to splay it out a little bit to help hold the weave. So I'll pull the wire forwards and carefully hammer the end. I then want to hammer all of these wires just a little bit on the back to strengthen them. I'll pull these 2 wires forwards, and it's easiest to do this over the edge of a table. For the other wires, you can hammer straight onto the back. And then finally, to get that top wire in position, I'll just make a bend so the end of the wire is sitting just below that top piece of the frame. Then I'm ready to start adding the beads. And I'll start in the middle, adding my copper beads onto the frame wire. I'm going to put 5 beads on here. Then I'll trim that wire and make a small loop on the end for one of my drops. I'm then going to add my small peridot beads onto the left-hand side. So I'll thread on my first bead, just bend the wire to make sure that it sits nicely. And then wrap that weaving wire 2 or 3 times around the frame wire. I'll then add the next bead in the same way. And continue for the length that I want. To help secure this section, I can attach it to the frame in the same way as I did before by taking the weaving wire through and then continue adding the beads. Now before I finish this section, I'm going to add the beads at the top. So I'll attach another piece of weaving wire just above that first bead. I'll wrap it 2 or 3 times around the frame and then add the beads as before. Once I've finished adding the beads, I'll wrap the weaving wire around a few more times and then take it through the frame wire to attach it at the top, and then finish with a few more wraps. Now I'm happy with that number of beads, so I'll trim off the end of the weaving wire, make sure it's sitting flush to the frame wire. Then I can trim that frame wire and make another loop on the end. And on the right hand side of the pendant, I'm going to add some small garnets in exactly the same way as I did with the peridot. So I thread a bead on and then wrap the weaving wire 2 times around the frame wire and just continue to the length that I want. Now I'm not going to add a drop to the end of this wire, so I'm just going to trim it off a few millimetres down from the beads and very carefully hammer the end. I can then make a few more wraps on the wire and then trim off that weaving wire. Now I just need to make a loop to hang the drops with, and to do this I'll take my 0.4mm wire through the drop, take both ends upwards and wrap one once around the other and trim the wire. I'll then make my loop and wrap downwards over that previous wrapping and down over the top of the drop. I'm just going to take this down to where the holes in the drop are and then trim. I'll then open the loops I've made on the pendant and add the drops. Finally, I'll use the jump rings to add the necklace chain to the top of the pendant. And the pendant is finished. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please press the like button below. And don't forget you can subscribe to my channel and head over to my website for more hints, tips and projects. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.